Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 2nd of July. Today we do have a lot of important developments in contrast to yesterday where it was relatively uneventful. And we're going to begin with Staromaiorske, but I do recommend nonetheless watching yesterday's video because I did cover some important shakeups with the Ukrainian command at the end of the video. But in any case, let's look at the changes here because last month we discussed the Russian capture of the village of Staromaiorske, which really occurred due to the Russians utilizing these motorcycle squads and, of course, using motorcycles lends to more mobility, being able to move as an individual faster into an area that's on the line of contact in a gray zone like Staromaiorske. And so a lot of Russian soldiers, through that means of transportation, were able to dismount and then occupy the ruins of the village. And then, of course, they were aided by attacks with columns, especially with MTLBs that dismounted just south or just west of the village. And so the Russians, of course, secured the village, which puts Oruzhenie in a tough spot. And now we have this report from the Russian MOD where they released footage which has been geolocated to the trench north of Staromaiorske, which I talked about last month, saying that it's very important that Ukraine maintain control over this horizontal tree line in order to prevent the Russians from continuing their momentum all the way up north to the village of Makarivka, because this is really the only sort of defense the Ukrainians have in the region before reaching that village. And then there aren't many other well-built defenses directly near the Mokryali River as you go further north to other hamlets here. But you do, of course, once you look a bit further west, you do see that there are some other defenses the Ukrainians built on this local ridge. And so that's also the region that you're not seeing as many Russian advances through. The Russians are advancing along the roads that have been paved, or specifically one road that's been paved parallel basically to the Mokryali River and through nearby fields. And they're doing so while overlooking the battlefield from their own ridges that are located west of the river valley. And that's a big advantage they have as they continue trying to push forward using this momentum. So looking at the video the Russian MOD posted, you could see that it's from today and that the Russians northwards, they were able to advance something that amounts to, let's say, 600 kilometers or 600 meters. Yeah. And then to the northwest, they were able to advance nearly 1 kilometer, 900 meters, you could say. And during the dismount from the actual motorcycle, the Russian infantry, and I think I saw like 5 in the video, they got out, fought in the trenches, tried to clear them out, close quarters engagements. And according to Russian sources, these motorcycle crews are also involved in transporting these smaller pieces of equipment, whether it be ammo crates or food. And so they're also using it in that capacity, but also for frontline activities, like very quickly reaching a region before, a drone could spot them or artillery fire could be fixed upon them. And so we talked yesterday about the way in which motorcycles were destroyed by the Ukrainians south of Novomikhailivka, but in this case, the motorcycle crews were successful in advancing. Now, moving on to the Vovcha River front, we're going to begin just east of Nevelske, where there was a lot of ambiguity in June. We didn't get a lot of information surrounding Russian advances here. It appears that the Russian troop concentration here decreased, and the Ukrainians, whatever forces they did have, mainly from the 11th Battalion of the 59th Motorized Brigade, were holding positions in really exposed areas in a salient, in open fields, and in certain dugouts that now, according to Deep State's mapping, have changed into actual Russian hands. And we can actually see that here the Russians were able to gain around 2.25 square kilometers in that advance through this region over here specifically. And so this was likely done from the Donetsk Ring Road to the east and also from the northern flank around Prvomaiske. And so the Russian forces were able to advance in this region. And this is just a small part of fully clearing out all of the fields. And there are just so many fields in this region where you have small numbers of Ukrainian forces just trying to buy time while the Ukrainian defenders on the ridge west of the Vovcha River continue trying to set up defenses. And so that's the role essentially of the 11th Battalion. But of course, even with a small troop concentration, the Russian forces are able to gradually push through and clear out these regions. And now they are very close to fully expelling the Ukrainians from Nevelske, which is the only real organized settlement that they have to coordinate, essentially. Everything else just includes trenches or tree lines. And you could already see the Russians are in control of nearly half of Novelske and continue pushing from the east. The Ukrainians only maintain control over the warehouses. Further north, we have further confirmation that the Russian forces have reached this dividing line, which is a low-lying, I guess you could say, stream that goes to the southeast. And this is a video from July 1st from the 11th Battalion. They just show a compilation of drone drops onto Russian soldiers in the forested area south of Natalove, and then actual FPV strikes on the houses within Natalove. And that's happening, of course, because the village Natalove is just so important for Russia's continued expansion in every single direction, barring the eastern side where they advanced through initially. And so it really has served as a operating node from which Russian advances then blossom out, essentially. And we can see that with another update from today, which occurred in the region north of the Karlivka Reservoir, or north of the tip over here, the southern tip of Karlivka. So you have this region that is near the crossing of the reservoir, very narrow crossing that the Ukrainians continue using to send reinforcements to maintain control over what I refer to as the Yasna-Berdivka bridgehead. And so what we see is a continued Russian push along this paved road and along the accompanying fields. And then they're just going house to house and clearing them out. In one case, we have a geolocated video. I have it marked over here, I believe. Actually, it's the one over here. And it's from June 2nd. It shows Russian sapper units. They were able to reach a Ukrainian position. And so they threw a TM-62 anti-tank mine into the house and just completely destroyed it using it. Just due to the blast radius that was created, it incurred massive damage to the house. And that to show us where the Russians are currently operating, as they have forward elements that are trying to sabotage the Ukrainian makeshift defensive positions. And you can see generally that the houses here are suffering from large damage. They're not completely flattened, but they are in the process of being targeted by large Russian artillery strikes. And so that's an issue because now the Russian forces are only about 700, 800 meters away from that crossing of the reservoir. And that puts into question how the Ukrainians that are still operating in Yasna-Berdivka could safely withdraw. At this point, it seems more likely that if the Russians continue pushing along this axis, they're going to have to try to withdraw from the northwest towards the village of Skuchny and then cross over the Vovcha River in those particular areas. And regarding the rest of the Vovcha River fronts, we also do have an important Russian advance that occurred in the region north of Novoselivka-Persha. First of all, north of the village, we have this large fortress, which I do believe is still under Ukrainian control because there's no proof pointing otherwise. And it is an important node that is protecting that road that directly bisects the village. And really losing this trench system would be the checkmate for the Ukrainian defenders here. They would just be exposed already from the east, where they lost Novopokrovske, already being harassed along the road leading directly into the village, and then even losing the northern route into the village. It would just be lethal for whatever defenders are still there. And Novoselivka-Persha is an important village because you do have this particular road that is used to cross over the Vovcha River in one of the lower lying parts of the river. It's very shallow there. And you also have a nearby fortress that the Ukrainians built and now connecting to the rest of the river trench line west of the river. And the Russians would just have access to it by means of capturing the village Novoselivka-Persha. And so you have that, and then you have this other route over here through Mezhove, which is also on a very shallow part of the river. And so the Ukrainians, it's not just for their operations east of the river, but also potentially undermining their defenses that they're trying to build west of the river. And so the video that we have released is from July 2nd, and it shows the Ukrainians shelling these tree lines just south of Voskod. And this gives us confirmation that the Russian forces are operating in this this field region over here. It's a relatively large area that we previously marked as a gray zone. It's around 2 square kilometers that the Russian forces were able to capture as per this video, and it could be more if the Russians were also able to establish control over this entire portion of the vertical road that then also connects to the western part of Sokil. And given the fact that you now have a lot of Russian activity, for now it's more so on foot, but we're going to also start seeing a a lot of vehicles begin to come up now, taking advantage of the forward momentum the Russians have. It does raise questions about the status of hamlets such as Voskod and Ivanivka that are directly connected to Sokil through two roads, and those roads are ones that Russian BTRs and MTLBs have constantly been driving through, albeit a lot of them are getting damaged. The ones that make it through, they are crucial in allowing Russia to continue their advances westwards. And so you have to keep an eye out for that, because the region that Russia advanced through in these fields is located on a local hill that overlooks all three villages that we just talked about. Persha, Ivanivka, Voskod, all the regions that Ukraine still maintains near the line of contact, and also the fortresses they have west of Ivanivka. And lastly, we have this slight advance, which is from the general low-lying tree line that you see marked over here that the Russians were recently able to capture. And since then, they've just continued advancing. Their infantry squads are not facing a large amount of resistance here, simply due to the fact that there are so many other pressing parts of this specific line, including directly fighting within the villages, that you don't have as many forces perhaps defending on this northern flank. I just haven't seen as many videos from this region, and that's why I'm saying this, because although the Russians continue advancing here, the concentration of videos is lower than in an area like Sokil itself, or in villages further south that we talked about near Karolivka, for instance. But nonetheless, the Russians continue pushing here, also with relatively small squads, but we did see them use larger squads in their infiltration into Sokil itself. In the process, the Russian forces were able to capture this specific fortress, or just assortment of trenches, you could say. And this is all a part of the general ridge that is located on the railway embankment and then extends both northwards and southwards. The Russians really have made great use of this geographical advantage, and that's a big part of why they've been able to just continue advancing westwards and westwards gradually. And throughout that entire process, it's helped them with their northern flank, which has been really crucial in advancing through Sloviove and then Sokil, and for the future also into villages that are west of the Vovcha River or are on the river crossing in relatively shallow parts of that river. And you have a lot of those sort of gaps now that are being exposed, and it's really a question of whether the Ukrainians could organize their forces in a cohesive manner and build enough defenses in order to prevent the Russian advantage along the railway vector from overwhelming them. Now in Chasiv Yar, we have some important news. A video released today by the 98th VDV Division shows the Russians hoisting a flag, including the Russian flag and then the 98th Division's flag, from a multi-story building. Actually, the southwesternmost one that you see marked over here in this corner. It's from July 2nd, of course. And so what this confirms to us is that you have a Russian presence very close to the canal. We don't know about these defenses that were built just east of it by the Ukrainians. Perhaps those are still controlled by them, and those are located on a local embankment, and so they're also important for the Russians to clear out before advancing through various choke points across the canal, which still remains to be seen because not the entire canal district has been cleared out, but the Russians have just made a major step in fully cleansing this easternmost district of Chasiv Yar. Basically, over the past 2 weeks, they've been involved in fierce urban fighting to clear out these apartment complexes that you see marked over here within my ruler, and they've been successful in doing so. It's mainly paratroopers involved in this, and then they're receiving a lot of support from TOS-1A, flamethrower fire, and other means of artillery. That's mainly what we've seen, not as much from the Air Force here, but nonetheless, we do see in the videos of the damage that a lot of these apartment buildings are partially destroyed. I don't see as many structures completely leveled, but you do have, for instance, garages and smaller houses that are just completely decimated due to the shelling, and then a lot of the apartments are harder to defend, harder to use defending because of the Russian shelling. And in terms of the extent of the Russian advance, it amounts to something like 300 meters westwards, and so it is an important advance because it puts pressure on the remaining Ukrainian defenders that are now very small in size, despite attempts to send in reinforcements using MRAPs. And so they're really concentrated in this northwestern corner. It's not even northwestern, but just this corner here with some apartments and then garages and then just forested regions before you reach this crossing of the canal, which is going to be very important for the Ukrainians to maintain control over, or at least fire control of, to prevent the Russians from undermining the Ukrainian defense line just west of it. And so what we're seeing generally is that the Ukrainian control here has shrunk extremely by a large amount, and the Russian forces are close to fully clearing out this district. And this is a part of really Russia's preparation for fully cleansing the area east of the canal. And they've done this through three vectors. First, through Kalina, where they were able to expose gaps in the Ukrainian line 2 times, and the second time they were able to make it permanent. And since then, they've been able to reach the actual canal and advance southwards, and now are roaming through the forest itself. They've made forays across the canal, but have not been able to maintain a permanent control there. And so this is really important. In terms of elevation, they don't really have an advantage from operating in the forest because it is one of the lower lying regions. But then Kalina itself and the fields north of it are actually located on an important ridge. Then further south, we have, of course, the vector of advance through the garages, which has been successful for the Russians. They've pushed through and just continued pushing southwest. That also put pressure on the Ukrainian northern flank in the Canal District, also an important area due to its high elevation. And same thing with the advance directly through the apartments. Those are apartments that they may not be overlooking Chasiv Yar itself because that's also on a massive ridge, but at least they're putting the Russians on parity, and so they at least have some sort of line of sight across the canal. Now, looking at the Luhansk front, we do have a slight change here. The Russians, we talked about in the last video, gradually pushing through Makivka, just occupying small points where there may not have been Ukrainian positions that really were present because it's just so close to the front line. And you could see this with the 66th Mechanized Brigade Ukrainian unit shelling the Russian forces as they were trying to advance through tree lines. And then just slightly south, the Russian forces were actually able to make a gain that is important along a tree line, advancing 1.5 kilometers, and have reached this vertical road that runs along the Zherbets River. And the Zherbets River here is very narrow, very shallow in relation to what it is further south. And now they were actually able to cut off that road, which will affect the Ukrainian logistics near the front line. It's not like they were heavily using this beforehand, but you do have to now make a longer turn if you're trying to connect between various villages in Makivka and Nevske, respectively, just because of the fact that this area is more rural. There aren't as many well-maintained roads, especially over 2 years into this war. And so every single road is important regardless of its distance from the front line. But yeah, now you do have this Russian push here. And in terms of the units that are involved, there may be some tank regiments that are floating around here. And then we talked about the 20th Combined Arms Army generally operating in the Luhansk sector. But it's not like there's a massive force committed to these operations. It's more so positional in nature. And you could say the same thing about this spearhead towards Selmakivka. Selmakivka is important for the Russians to take over in the long term when you're looking at the regions east of Kupiansk, because it is the largest Ukrainian defense node in the region, which is home to the 77th Air Assault Brigade. It's where they're conducting a lot of their defensive operations through, and you already have the northern flank from Berestove, and you have a large Russian sort of position in the regions northwest of Svatove. And so Stelmakivka is really important for the Russians to eventually capture. But in terms of the recent advance, they were able to really take over 2 kilometers, you could say, westwards through tree lines. We're seeing a pattern of this Russian infantry just trying to gradually advance through a low-lying tree line without the Ukrainians noticing in time, and then basically setting camp very close to their defensive hubs in order to overwhelm them, and of course utilizing the flanks. But for now, there isn't any change in the status of control over the village. And so that's all that for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.